Chicago in the 1990s was a city teeming with life, but also weighed down by social struggles. Neighborhoods like Englewood, one of the city's most crime-ridden areas, bore the brunt of systemic neglect, poverty, and addiction. Amid the backdrop of boarded-up homes and drug-ridden streets, a series of brutal murders sent shockwaves through the community. The killer preyed on some of society's most vulnerable, the unhoused and women struggling with addiction. For years, the identity of the predator remained a mystery, until the chilling truth emerged. Andre Crawford, a man who had walked among his victims, was responsible. This is the story of how Crawford's horrifying spree unfolded, his chilling confessions, and the painstaking investigation that brought his reign of terror to an end. Andre Crawford was born on March 20, 1962, into an unstable and abusive environment. His childhood was marked by neglect and violence, a breeding ground for the deep psychological scars that would define his later actions. Raised in Chicago, Crawford experienced severe physical abuse at the hands of his mother and stepfather. Witnesses later described his home life as chaotic, with little to no structure or affection. Crawford's early exposure to trauma became evident as he began to act out in school. Teachers noted his withdrawn demeanor and violent outbursts. As he grew older, he dropped out of high school and began a transient lifestyle, bouncing between menial jobs and periods of homelessness. By the 1980s, Crawford had become entrenched in Chicago's drug scene, frequenting the very neighborhoods that would later become his hunting ground. His spiral into addiction and crime set the stage for his horrifying transformation into a serial killer. Crawford's reign of terror began in the early 1990s, though investigators believe his first murder may have occurred as early as 1987. His victims were primarily women who lived on the fringes of society, sex workers and those struggling with addiction. Crawford used their vulnerabilities to his advantage, luring them with the promise of drugs or companionship. Once alone with his victims, Crawford unleashed his violent impulses. He often raped them before strangling or beating them to death. His methods were brutal and intimate, reflective of a deep-seated rage. The first known victim, Patricia Dunn, was found in 1993 in an abandoned building in Englewood. Like many of Crawford's later victims, Dunn's body bore signs of sexual assault and strangulation. Her murder marked the beginning of a pattern that would haunt the city for years. Throughout the 1990s, bodies continued to turn up in vacant lots and abandoned buildings across Englewood. Many of the crime scenes were within a few blocks of one another, yet police initially struggled to connect the murders. The victims were often overlooked by society, their disappearances and deaths receiving little media attention. This lack of urgency allowed Crawford to operate with impunity. Despite the mounting body count, Chicago police faced significant challenges. The Englewood area was plagued by high crime rates, and resources were stretched thin. DNA technology, still in its infancy, offered little assistance in the early years of the investigation. Moreover, the victims' transient lifestyles made it difficult to establish clear timelines or links between the cases. By 1999, the community was on edge. The brutal nature of the murders and their concentration in a small area fueled rumors of a serial killer. Yet, without concrete evidence or a suspect, the killer remained an elusive phantom. In December 1999, investigators finally caught a break. Advances in DNA technology allowed police to link several of the murders to a single perpetrator. The breakthrough came when a DNA profile obtained from the crime scenes matched a sample in the National CODIS database. The profile belonged to Andre Crawford, whose DNA had been collected following a prior arrest for drug possession. Crawford was arrested on January 28, 2000. Under interrogation, he confessed to a chilling total of 11 murders, all committed between 1993 and 1999. His detailed confessions painted a harrowing picture of his crimes. Crawford's confessions revealed a disturbed and remorseless individual. He admitted to luring his victims with promises of crack cocaine or shelter, exploiting their vulnerabilities to gain their trust. Once they were alone, he would attack, often beating and raping them before strangling them to death. What set Crawford apart from other killers was his brazenness. After murdering his victims, he sometimes returned to their bodies to engage in necrophilic acts. This grotesque behavior highlighted the depth of his depravity and his total lack of empathy. Psychologists later examined Crawford's motivations, attributing his actions to a combination of childhood trauma, deep-seated misogyny, and a need for power and control. His drug addiction likely exacerbated his violent tendencies, creating a volatile cocktail of rage and compulsive behavior. Crawford's trial began in 2009, nearly a decade after his arrest. The delay was largely due to the complexity of the case and the sheer number of victims involved. Prosecutors presented overwhelming evidence, including DNA matches and Crawford's own confessions. The testimonies of surviving victims also played a crucial role in securing his conviction. On December 17, 2009, Andre Crawford was found guilty of 11 counts of murder and 1 count of attempted murder. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The case of Andre Crawford remains a haunting reminder of the vulnerabilities of marginalized communities and the systemic failures that allowed him to evade capture for so long. His crimes expose the devastating consequences of societal neglect, where the lives of the most vulnerable are often deemed expendable. For the families of Crawford's victims, the conviction brought some measure of closure, but the scars of his actions remain. In the years since his sentencing, the city of Chicago has grappled with the lingering trauma of his crimes, striving to address the conditions that allowed such horrors to occur. Andre Crawford's story is one of brutality and brokenness, a tale that underscores the darkest corners of human nature. Lonnie David Franklin Jr., later infamously dubbed the Grim Sleeper, is one of America's most chilling serial killers. Over a span of more than 2 decades, Franklin preyed on vulnerable women in South Los Angeles, leaving a trail of at least 10 confirmed victims and an untold number of others suspected. His calculated ability to blend into the fabric of his community, coupled with systemic neglect of his victims, allowed him to remain undetected for years. This is the story of how the Grim Sleeper earned his title and how justice finally caught up to him. Born on August 30, 1952, Lonnie David Franklin Jr. grew up in South Central Los Angeles. Despite the notoriety of his later crimes, little about his childhood stands out in the public record. What is known paints a picture of a relatively ordinary upbringing, though certain events hinted at his darker proclivities. Franklin enlisted in the U.S. Army in the early 1970s and served in Germany. It was during this period that his violent tendencies first emerged. In 1974, he and 2 other soldiers were convicted of abducting and gang-raping a 17-year-old girl. The crime involved photographing the assault, a disturbing foreshadowing of Franklin's later behavior. While Franklin was sentenced to time in prison, his punishment was minimal, and he was dishonorably discharged from the Army. Returning to Los Angeles, Franklin led a seemingly unremarkable life. He worked as a mechanic and sanitation worker, and was known as a helpful neighbor. Yet beneath this facade, Franklin harbored the instincts of a predator, and the streets of South Los Angeles would soon feel his wrath. In the mid-1980s, Los Angeles was in the grip of a crack cocaine epidemic that devastated communities, particularly in neighborhoods like South Central. Amid the chaos, women began to disappear, their bodies later found discarded in alleys, dumpsters, and vacant lots. Many of the victims were sex workers or women battling addiction, making them easy targets for a cunning predator. The Grim Sleeper's first confirmed victim, Deborah Jackson, was discovered on August 10, 1985. Jackson, a 29-year-old, had been shot 3 times in the chest with a .25 caliber handgun. Her body was left in an alley, discarded like trash. Over the next few years, the killings followed a grimly consistent pattern. The victims were lured into Franklin's vehicle, often with the promise of drugs or money. He would sexually assault them and then shoot them at close range. After killing them, Franklin would dispose of their bodies in public locations, displaying a chilling indifference to the value of human life. Between 1985 and 1988, at least 7 women were murdered, and their deaths were eventually linked to the Grim Sleeper. The killer earned his moniker because of a supposed 14-year hiatus in his crimes between 1988 and 2002. However, investigators later theorized that the sleep was merely a gap in discovered murders, not a cessation of his activities. The Grim Sleeper's ability to operate for so long was partly due to systemic neglect. The victims were predominantly black women living in impoverished areas, many of whom were sex workers or struggled with addiction. Law enforcement and the media gave little attention to their disappearances or deaths, reinforcing the community's sense of being abandoned by those sworn to protect them. In the late 1980s, the Los Angeles Police Department, LAPD, faced immense pressure as South Los Angeles became a hotspot for violent crime. Resources were stretched thin, and cases involving marginalized victims were often deprioritized. Additionally, the crack epidemic and distrust of police in the community created an environment in which the Grim Sleeper could thrive unnoticed. The term Southside Slayer was initially used to describe a spate of murders targeting women in South Los Angeles. While multiple serial killers were active in the area during this time, it wasn't until years later that detectives separated the Grim Sleeper's crimes from those of other killers. After 1988, the killings seemingly stopped, and the Grim Sleeper faded into obscurity. For over a decade, there were no bodies linked to his pattern. Then, in 2002, Franklin resurfaced with the murder of Princess Berthomieu, a 15-year-old girl whose body was found strangled. Over the next 5 years, more bodies appeared, bearing his signature. The Grim Sleeper's final known victim, Janisha Peters, was found in January 2007. The 25-year-old's body was discovered in a dumpster, wrapped in a trash bag. The carelessness of the disposal spoke to Franklin's increasing confidence that he would never be caught. The key to unmasking the Grim Sleeper lay in the advances of DNA technology. In 2007, investigators were able to link DNA evidence from multiple crime scenes, confirming that the same individual was responsible. Despite this breakthrough, there was no match in the National CODIS database, leaving investigators at an impasse. It wasn't until 2010 that a groundbreaking technique known as familial DNA matching provided the critical lead. The DNA evidence from the crime scenes partially matched a sample in the system, pointing to one of Franklin's relatives, his son Christopher, who had been arrested on an unrelated charge. Investigators surmised that Christopher's father might be the elusive Grim Sleeper. To confirm their suspicions, undercover officers followed Franklin to a restaurant and collected a discarded pizza crust. The DNA retrieved from the crust was an exact match to the evidence collected at the crime scenes, and Franklin was arrested on July 7, 2010. The search of Lonnie Franklin Jr.'s home revealed a chilling cache of evidence. Police discovered photographs and videos of over 180 women, many of whom appeared unconscious or deceased. Among the images were confirmed victims, but the identities of many women remain unknown to this day. Additionally, investigators found the .25 caliber handgun used in several of the murders, as well as personal belongings of some of the victims. The sheer volume of evidence suggested that Franklin's victim count could far exceed the 10 murders for which he was charged. Lonnie Franklin Jr.'s trial began in February 2016, nearly 6 years after his arrest. Prosecutors presented overwhelming evidence, including DNA matches, ballistics, and testimony from a surviving victim, Enietra Washington, who had been shot and left for dead by Franklin in 1988 but miraculously survived. Washington's harrowing testimony was a cornerstone of the case, providing a first-hand account of the Grim Sleeper's cruelty. On May 5, 2016, Franklin was convicted of 10 counts of murder and 1 count of attempted murder. During the sentencing phase, the jury heard additional evidence suggesting Franklin was responsible for at least 25 more murders. On August 10, 2016, Franklin was sentenced to death. Lonnie Franklin Jr. died on March 28, 2020, while on death row at San Quentin State Prison. His death, reportedly from natural causes, ended the life of one of America's most notorious serial killers, though it left many questions unanswered. How many women did he truly kill? How many families will never receive closure? The Grim Sleeper case highlighted systemic failures in addressing violence against marginalized communities. Many of Franklin's victims were ignored by society, their disappearances treated as insignificant. Activists like Margaret Prescott and the Black Coalition Fighting Back Serial Murders fought tirelessly to bring attention to these cases, forcing law enforcement and the public to confront their biases. The Grim Sleeper's story is one of terror, negligence, and resilience. Joel Rifkin, often overshadowed by more infamous serial killers, left a trail of devastation across New York during the late 1980s and early 1990s. Rifkin, whose unassuming demeanor masked a deeply disturbed psyche, was convicted of murdering 9 women, but is suspected of killing as many as 17. His brutality, combined with his chilling confessions, revealed a man driven by uncontrollable compulsions and deep-seated resentment. This is the story of Joel Rifkin, his rise to infamy, and the horrors he inflicted upon his victims. Born on January 20, 1959 in New York City, Joel Rifkin's life began under difficult circumstances. He was adopted by Bernard and Jean Rifkin when he was 3 weeks old. The Rifkins provided a stable, middle-class upbringing for Joel in East Meadow, Long Island, but his early years were marred by difficulties. Joel struggled socially and academically. He was relentlessly bullied at school, mocked for his awkward demeanor and lack of athleticism. His dyslexia, undiagnosed for years, further alienated him. Rifkin became a shy, introverted teenager who often retreated into fantasies of control and dominance. His obsession with violent pornography and true crime stories began during this time, laying the groundwork for his later crimes. After graduating high school, Rifkin briefly attended college but struggled academically and socially, dropping out of several institutions. He bounced between jobs, never holding steady employment, and lived at home with his parents well into adulthood. By the late 1980s, Rifkin was living a life of quiet desperation. He spent much of his time alone, frequenting sex workers in Manhattan to satisfy his growing urges. These encounters were not enough to quell his fantasies of violence, and by 1989, he made the decision to kill. Rifkin's first victim was Heidi Balch, a 25-year-old sex worker he picked up in Manhattan on March 5, 1989. After taking her back to his home in East Meadow, Rifkin bludgeoned her with a heavy object and strangled her to death. He dismembered her body using an X-Acto knife and disposed of the parts in various locations, including the Hudson River and a garbage barge. For years, Balch remained a Jane Doe, known only as Susie, until her identity was confirmed through DNA testing in 2013. Rifkin later described his first murder as a turning point, claiming it awakened a dark part of him that he could no longer control. Over the next 4 years, Rifkin would claim at least 16 more victims, all sex workers. His methods became increasingly violent and depraved, with many of his victims suffering sexual assault and brutal strangulation. After killing them, Rifkin often kept their bodies for days or even weeks, hiding them in his home or car before disposing of them. His disposal methods were as calculated as they were gruesome. He frequently dismembered his victims and scattered their remains across New York and New Jersey, ensuring they would be difficult to identify. Rifkin was methodical, but his lack of social connections and inability to maintain relationships made him a loner who flew under the radar of law enforcement. Among his victims were Barbara Jacobs, whose remains were found in the Hudson River in 1991. Mary Ellen DeLuca, a 22-year-old whose body was discovered in a wooded area in Orange County, New York. Tiffany Bresciani, a 22-year-old sex worker and Rifkin's final known victim, whose body was found in the trunk of his car at the time of his arrest. Joel Rifkin's killing spree came to an abrupt end on June 28, 1993, after a chance encounter with law enforcement. Driving without a license plate on his Mazda pickup truck, Rifkin caught the attention of New York State troopers. When they attempted to pull him over, he led them on a brief high-speed chase before crashing into a utility pole. As officers approached the vehicle, they were immediately hit with a foul odor emanating from the trunk. Inside, they found the decomposing body of Tiffany Bresciani wrapped in a blue tarp. Under questioning, Rifkin confessed to killing her, and went on to provide a detailed account of his other murders. Rifkin's confessions revealed a deeply disturbed individual. He spoke candidly about his motives, describing a combination of anger, sexual frustration, and a desire for control. He targeted sex workers because he believed they were vulnerable and less likely to be missed, a chilling reflection of his dehumanization of his victims. Psychologists who examined Rifkin noted his lack of remorse and his detached demeanor when discussing his crimes. He exhibited many traits of a psychopathic killer, including a complete inability to empathize with his victims. Rifkin himself acknowledged that his urges were insatiable, and he likely would have continued killing if not for his arrest. Rifkin was charged with 9 murders, though he confessed to at least 17. He initially pleaded not guilty, but later changed his plea to guilty for several of the murders. His defense team argued that he suffered from mental illness and was incapable of controlling his actions, but the jury was unconvinced. On May 9, 1994, Joel Rifkin was sentenced to 203 years to life in prison, effectively ensuring he would never walk free again. He is currently incarcerated at the Clinton Correctional Facility in Dannemora, New York, where he spends much of his time in solitary confinement due to threats from other inmates. The case of Joel Rifkin remains one of the most chilling chapters in the history of American serial killers. While his name may not be as widely recognized as others, his crimes highlight the dangers faced by society's most vulnerable populations and the systemic failures that allow predators to thrive in the shadows. Lloyd Gomez, a largely overlooked but no less chilling figure in the annals of American crime, was a serial killer who operated in California during the early 1950s. Known as the Hobo Killer, Gomez targeted homeless men, bludgeoning them to death with blunt objects. His crimes revealed a shocking degree of brutality and an apparent disregard for human life, but they also highlighted the social indifference toward victims on society's margins. This is the story of Lloyd Gomez, a man whose brief but deadly rampage left a haunting legacy. Lloyd Gomez was born on December 6, 1923 in Stockton, California. His childhood, like many of his era, was marked by hardship. Growing up during the Great Depression, Gomez experienced poverty and instability that shaped his worldview. His family struggled to make ends meet, and Gomez himself dropped out of school early to work in menial labor jobs, often traveling from town to town. By the time he reached adulthood, Gomez had developed a reputation for being a loner. Friends and acquaintances described him as a quiet but volatile man, prone to angry outbursts. Despite his troubled temperament, there was little in his background to foreshadow the horrifying spree he would embark on. In 1950, Lloyd Gomez began a series of murders that would earn him infamy. Over the course of several months, Gomez bludgeoned at least 9 homeless men to death across California. His weapon of choice varied. He used rocks, hammers, and pieces of wood, but his method was always brutal, ensuring his victims died from severe head trauma. Gomez targeted transient men, often those living in or near train yards or under bridges. These men, already forgotten by society, were easy prey. Gomez would approach them under the guise of camaraderie before launching a sudden, violent attack. The killings were opportunistic but deliberate, reflecting Gomez's simmering anger and lack of remorse. Investigators later speculated that Gomez's choice of victims stemmed from his own deep-seated resentment toward his transient lifestyle. As someone who had lived on the fringes of society himself, he may have viewed his victims as representations of his own failures and frustrations. Lloyd Gomez's killing spree came to an end in April 1951 after he murdered his ninth victim. The body of James Logan, a 60-year-old homeless man, was discovered in a Sacramento train yard. Logan's skull had been crushed by a large rock, and investigators quickly linked the crime to a string of similar murders across the state. Gomez was arrested shortly after Logan's murder. Under interrogation, he confessed to the killings in chilling detail, describing how he selected his victims and carried out the murders. Gomez exhibited no remorse during his confessions, even going so far as to blame his victims for their own deaths. His cold demeanor shocked detectives, who described him as one of the most remorseless individuals they had ever encountered. Lloyd Gomez was charged with 9 counts of murder, but prosecutors focused on the murder of James Logan to expedite the trial. During his court proceedings, Gomez's defense team attempted to argue insanity, claiming that his transient lifestyle and mental instability drove him to kill. However, this argument failed to sway the jury. On June 18, 1951, Lloyd Gomez was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to death. He was sent to San Quentin State Prison to await execution. While on death row, Gomez reportedly showed little emotion, maintaining his indifferent attitude toward his crimes. On October 16, 1953, Lloyd Gomez was executed in the gas chamber at San Quentin. His death marked the end of a brief but horrifying chapter in California's criminal history. The case of Lloyd Gomez, while not as well known as other serial killers, remains significant for its brutal simplicity and the stark reminder it offers about society's vulnerabilities. Gomez's victims were largely ignored by the public and law enforcement, their disappearances and deaths garnering little attention until his arrest. The indifference toward homeless individuals in the 1950s mirrors ongoing struggles to protect vulnerable populations today. Gomez's story also underscores the complexities of human violence. A product of hardship and alienation, he turned his anger outward, targeting those who mirrored his own struggles. While his crimes were heinous and unforgivable, they also reflect the dangers of neglecting the most marginalized in society. Christopher Bernard Wilder, also known as the Beauty Queen Killer, was a suave, wealthy predator whose killing spree spanned several states in the early 1980s. Using his charm and success as a cover, Wilder lured young women, often aspiring models, into his web of terror. Between February and April 1984, he brutally assaulted and murdered at least 8 women, though authorities suspect his true victim count may be much higher. This is the chilling story of Christopher Wilder, a man whose charm hid a monstrous darkness, and the nationwide manhunt that finally ended his reign of terror. Christopher Wilder was born on March 13, 1945 in Sydney, Australia, to an American father and Australian mother. From a young age, Wilder displayed troubling signs of deviance. At the age of 17, he was convicted of participating in a gang rape, though he avoided prison by receiving probation and mandatory counseling. In 1969, Wilder moved to the United States, settling in Boynton Beach, Florida. On the surface, his life seemed enviable. He was a successful real estate developer and amateur race car driver with an affluent lifestyle. Wilder owned a sleek Porsche, dressed in designer clothing, and often frequented high-end social circles. However, beneath the polished exterior lurked a man driven by sadistic fantasies and a compulsive need to dominate and harm women. Throughout the 1970s and early 1980s, Wilder faced multiple charges of sexual assault, but his charm and financial resources allowed him to evade serious consequences. Many of his victims were young women whom he lured by posing as a photographer or talent scout. Wilder preyed on their dreams of fame, promising them modeling opportunities before subjecting them to horrific abuse. Wilder's escalating violence culminated in his infamous killing spree, which began in February 1984. Wilder's spree started in Florida, where he abducted and murdered 20-year-old Rosario Gonzalez on February 26, 1984. Gonzalez, an aspiring model, disappeared while working as a spokesmodel at a Miami Grand Prix event. Witnesses saw her leaving with Wilder, but her body was never found. Less than a month later, on March 5, 1984, Wilder struck again. Elizabeth Kenyon, a 23-year-old former Miss Florida contestant, vanished after leaving a meeting with Wilder. Like Gonzalez, Kenyon's body was never recovered, but her disappearance solidified Wilder's focus on targeting young women with modeling aspirations. Wilder then embarked on a cross-country rampage, leaving a trail of terror and death in his wake. His victims included Terry Ferguson, March 18, 1984. The 21-year-old was abducted from a shopping mall in Merritt Island, Florida. Her body was later found in a canal. She had been strangled. Sherry Lynn Ball, March 21, 1984. Wilder kidnapped the 18-year-old in Florida. Her decomposed body was found months later in Georgia. Colleen Osborne, March 15, 1984. A 15-year-old runaway who disappeared in Daytona Beach, Florida. Her body was discovered weeks later, though it was not linked to Wilder until years after his death. Suzanne Logan, March 25, 1984. Wilder abducted the 21-year-old from Oklahoma and forced her to accompany him to Texas, where he tortured and killed her. Her body was found in a remote area. Tina Marie Rizzico, April 1, 1984, a 16-year-old who Wilder abducted in California. He forced her to accompany him as his unwilling accomplice for several days. Wilder eventually released Rizzico in Kansas before continuing his spree. Michelle Korfman, April 4, 1984. An aspiring model, Korfman was last seen at a 17 magazine contest in Las Vegas. Her remains were found months later in California. Christopher Wilder's methods were as calculated as they were sinister. He used his wealth and charm to gain the trust of his victims, often approaching them in public places like malls, beauty pageants, or modeling events. Once he had lured them in with promises of fame and fortune, he would overpower them, holding them captive for hours or days while subjecting them to unspeakable acts of violence. Wilder's preference for young, beautiful women reflected his sadistic need for control. He was known to photograph his victims, a chilling act of voyeurism that reinforced his domination over them. Investigators later found several photos of unidentified women among Wilder's belongings, fueling fears that he had far more victims than confirmed. As Wilder's killing spree escalated, law enforcement across the United States launched an intense manhunt. The FBI added him to their 10 most wanted fugitives list on April 3, 1984. His inclusion marked a turning point in the case, as his crimes gained national media attention. Wilder's use of his Porsche and credit cards left a trail that helped authorities track his movements. However, his ability to charm and deceive those he encountered allowed him to evade capture for weeks. Each day of freedom meant another life at risk. Christopher Wilder's spree ended on April 13, 1984 in Colebrook, New Hampshire. While attempting to purchase a car at a dealership, Wilder was confronted by state troopers. In the ensuing struggle, Wilder attempted to draw a firearm, but the troopers opened fire, fatally wounding him. Wilder died at the scene, bringing his reign of terror to an end. In the wake of Wilder's death, investigators began piecing together the true extent of his crimes. He was conclusively linked to 8 murders, but authorities believe he may have killed up to 20 women, possibly more. Wilder's pattern of targeting aspiring models and young women highlighted the dangers posed by predators who exploit trust and ambition. The families of Wilder's victims were left grappling with unimaginable loss. For those whose loved ones were never found, the uncertainty added an extra layer of pain. Christopher Wilder's crimes shocked the nation and exposed glaring vulnerabilities in how society handles violence against women.